Right, hello everybody again. Yeah, haven't seen you for ages. Can't wait to see you all when things get back to normal. Okay, the good news is that we are on our last topic, topic 3 of the sociocultural approach, which is enculturation / acculturation. So we're very close to finishing the entire year 1 course. Whoopee! So today we're looking at enculturation and thinking about how it affects behaviour. Right, okay. So what is enculturation? You might want to pause the video here and just think about what enculturation is. What does it sound like it refers to? Have a think about it. You might want to note some ideas down. So this is one definition of enculturation, the process by which people learn the dynamics of their surrounding culture and acquire values and norms appropriate or necessary in that culture and the worldview of that culture. So it's how your culture has shaped you as you have grown up being part of it. As part of this process, the influences that limit, direct or shape the individual, whether deliberately or not, include parents, other adults and peers. I would also argue the media, education system. You know, it's a very broad field here. Culture isn't just limited to the influence of other people, it's the influence of institutions as well. If successful, enculturation results in competence in the language, values and rituals of the culture. So if you are to feel fully immersed in the culture in which you grow up, then you are comfortable with all aspects of it. Okay, so have a go at this. For the first question, we are the products of enculturation and we get there via vertical cultural transmission. Is this A, B or C? So what do you think vertical cultural transmission is? And then look at horizontal cultural transmission. Is it A, B, C or D? So we've got a few there. Okay, so have a go, see what you think. Right, okay. So vertical cultural transmission is the idea that culture is transmitted down to us from our parents. It's kind of a hierarchical system because we learn really everything about our social behaviour from our parents initially. They are the most important models for us. So this suggests it's a downward, from the top down direction. Now horizontal is obviously shared across. So here we have sharing the cultural transmission between friends and siblings, kind of people that you are more on a par with, you are more equal to, and other adults and social institutions. So again, it's not so much a hierarchical virtual transmission, it's more kind of the horizontal shared transmission. Okay, so you pause the video here, click on this link. This is a very interesting video. It uses the example of Elf, the film Elf, to look at how enculturation contributes to individual identity. So pause this presentation here and watch this video. It's very funny. Okay, so once you've watched that video, have a go at listing 3 cultural norms that you think have influenced the way you behave, your attitudes. So this shouldn't be something that is just particular to, say, your family. This should be wider than that. This should be something that is part of your culture, the wider culture that you've been brought up in. So, for example, within my culture, there are very basic cultural norms. For example, you use a knife and fork to eat your food. That's one cultural norm. It's shared by a lot of people. Another cultural norm, because I'm British, it's queuing. You queue up. You wait in line for a bus to be served in a shop. You do not push to the front of the queue. You do not ignore the queue and walk to the front. It is a huge faux pas to do that if you are British, or if you're in Britain and you're not British and it's the first time you've been do not ignore queuing. It's huge. It's a big deal if you just ignore the queue. Okay, and a third cultural norm might be something like, in Britain, we are not given to massive emotional displays. If you, for example, go to a funeral, people will not necessarily be showing their emotion very openly. They might cry quietly, but they won't weep and wail and tear their hair out and throw themselves on the coffin. Sorry, this is a bit of a negative example. But in some cultures, that's very much how you show your grief. But in this country, we've always been a little bit British people have always been a little bit wary of huge displays of emotion. Okay, so there's 3 examples. So you might want to think of 3 examples from your culture. Okay, so enculturation does not happen separately to us. It's not independent of us. It's not something that we can kind of key into or take a piece of when we want it. It is part of who we are. It is embedded in our identity, whether we like it or not. You know, you cannot divorce yourself from your culture. You can move away, you can go to a different country, a different culture, but enculturation will have affected you even if you don't want it to. So we're going to look further at particularly families and parents and how enculturation might affect the individual identity of maybe someone who is enrolled as a parent and the effect on their children. So let's have a look at what it says here. There is a distinction made in the research between cultures where individuals are characterized by an independent self-construal. That simply means a self-construal is the idea of yourself, the way that you view yourself, your self-image. What do I feel about myself? What person am I? So that's an independent self-construal is the way that you look at yourself. So that's independent self-construal, and societies where individuals have an interdependent self-construal. So an independent construal implies that a person sees themselves as an autonomous individual. Autonomous means I make my own decisions, I control what I do, I make my own way in life. So an autonomous individual separate from others. An interdependent self-construal characterizes a person who sees herself or himself as embedded in their social network. So if I have an interdependent self-construal, I would find it difficult to see myself as an individual in its entirety. I would be more likely to see myself as someone who is part of a group. So I am a mother, I am a daughter, I am a sister, I am a teacher who is part of this institution, I am a member of this group, I am a member of that group. The group is embedded in your self-identity. If you are from Western Europe or the USA or Australia, you would probably find it very difficult to understand an interdependent self-construal because individualistic societies don't emphasize that interdependence. They emphasize an independence. So I'm much more likely to view myself as me, an individual, and see all the groups I am part of as just groups I am part of. They're not part of me. Obviously, these are very broad definitions, and there's lots of, it's a sliding scale as to, how far you see yourself as independent or interdependent. So the identity of the parents affects their cultural transmission of values to their children, and their construal the way they see their children as autonomous or relational. So basically what that sentence means is, if you as a parent see yourself as an individual, okay, you're a parent, but you're also a person, you are more likely to view your children as individuals, as people who have their own ideas, their own viewpoint, who are not necessarily always going to agree with you, who want to go their own way in life. If you have an interdependent self-construal as a parent, you see yourself as a parent maybe more than you do as an individual. You see yourself as part of that familial group, that wider family group. So you expect your children to have the same idea of themselves as part of that group. So you won't necessarily expect your children to have autonomy over their ideas and behaviour. you would be more likely to think of your children as being part of the family rather than individuals first. So Keller et al. Argue that through generating in their caregivers contingent responses towards their own signals, we'll get to what that means in a minute, infants experience themselves as the cause for others' actions, and this fosters the independent self-construal. So this basically means the way that you are looked after by your parents, the way that you are nurtured by your parents, will foster in you either dependence or interdependence. So don't worry too much about if there are any words in there you don't understand. It's just basically, how have you been brought up, and have you been brought up to think of yourself as an individual or as a member of a group? Therefore, we would expect parents from Western middle-class families with an independent self-construal to foster this process. So, my parents are individuals, I'm an individual. Parents from a culture that fosters an interdependent self would be expected to have a different pattern of communication. For example, I am my parents' child. My parents are, my parents. They are kind of, if you like me, higher in the structure of this family. So we're starting from this viewpoint of individualistic societies produce parents and children who see themselves first and foremost as individual people, whereas a collectivist culture has parents and children who see themselves primarily as part of the familial group. I am a parent / I am a daughter or son. Right, okay. So an example is given below of the interactive relationship between attitudes to child rearing, a parent's self-construal and construal of their child's identity as autonomous or relational. So relational means I am a person in relation to other people. That's where I get my identity from, not necessarily from my own individuality. And behaviour toward the child encouraging independence or interdependence. So basically, it's kind of, if you come from a background where your autonomy has been emphasised, so that's kind of here. So remember that an autonomous self-construal is I am in control, I make my decisions, I am me, I'm not just a daughter or a son. So that would kind of inform your attitudes to child rearing. You're much more likely to bring up a child to think of themselves as an individual, to put their own needs maybe before other people's needs, to forge ahead as an individual. And that will also affect your behaviour towards your child. Do you raise your child as an individual and encourage their independence and their ambition and their autonomy, or do you bring your child up to be more focused on the group and the obligations to family and this more kind of, if you like, kind of caring attitude towards extended members of the family and the group? Okay, so you will find that I've attached the study Basu et al. This is our study of enculturation. You can also use this study for culture and its effect on behaviour. So you don't need to use any other studies. You can double up with this. You can do Basu et al. For culture and its effect on behaviour, for cultural norms, can you do it for cultural dimensions? I suppose you can, because you can look at the idea of the collectivist approach towards raising children. So it's a good study because you can use it for lots of different questions. You can also use it for research methods and for ethics, as you can for any study. It's also good because in year 2, when we do the development option, which the high level students only are doing, you can also use this when we look at gender identity. So it's a really good study. So if you can now, a good idea now is to pause the video to have a look at Basu's study that I've attached as well. And then I want you to fill in this table. Now you don't have to just use 3 points, you can use as many as you like. So look at the findings in Basu's study. So one finding that shows that an aspect of gender roles because it was 2 collectivist cultures that they looked at here. So write down what they found, just one example of it. How is this example evidence of enculturation? So basically, whatever your finding is here, then you write your interpretation of how it links to enculturation here, right? So it might be something like, I know girls are encouraged to help with the housework. That might be one of their findings. How is this an example evidence of enculturation? It could be something like within the culture, women would be traditionally expected to carry out domestic roles, domestic chores. That domestic chores within this culture seem to be entirely attributed to women, for example. So have a go at that. Okay, once you've done that, I thought it might be useful again to link this to research methods. Now, if you've got the generic question, explain the use of one research method used in the sociocultural approach, a short answer question, then you focus on the method. Now, the research method here is the narrative interview. Now, if you are doing paper 3, you can look at narrative or unstructured interviews in more depth. But if you are standard level, you still will need to know what a narrative interview is. I mean, the thing about this is you don't have to know about the narrative interview if you're standard level, because you may decide that you would not choose this study to answer a short answer question on research methods. But I would say it's always useful just to know it anyway, because on the day in the exam, you might think, God, I've really revised that Basu et al. Study. I really want to use it in my sociocultural answer. And if the question is the use of one research method and you haven't revised that method, you can't do the question. So it's always a good idea to know this anyway, even if you're standard level. So what you need to do first is find out what a narrative interview is. Now, it's a good idea to go to the InThinking site that I gave you, the college gave you access to. It was just before lockdown. You have a login for InThinking. It's a really good site for you to use. And you just go to the drop-down menu and you can find research methods or even paper 3, because paper 3 will have something on narrative interview there. There is also this site here which tells you what a narrative interview is. So, there's plenty of information out there for you. Okay, so once you've understood what a narrative interview is, this is a very simple, easy peasy task. So just use a couple of paragraphs, or you can use a bullet point list. I don't really mind. And I want you to suggest why this research method, the narrative interview, was chosen by Basu et al. To conduct the research into enculturation. So, think about the fact that this is not a lab experiment. So you don't use the term experiment because it's not an experiment. It's a qualitative research, and it's a narrative interview. So why do you think Basu et al. Used this method, and why was this a suitable method? It's a good method for them to have chosen. So you just list your ideas as to why a narrative interview might be good. You don't have to evaluate it, because remember, we are not doing ERQs for sociocultural. So we can just leave it there. We can leave it at the idea of explaining, and we don't go beyond explaining. Right, I hope that is everything. I hope I've covered everything that you need, and obviously let me know if you want any more help.